Okay, so looks like people are still coming in, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and start. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce Russell Taylor from Johns Hopkins, not the Russell Taylor here, yes. I know some of you have noticed the similarity in names. Russ received an undergraduate BS degree from Johns Hopkins many years ago, and he got his PhD from Stanford in 1976. After receiving his PhD, he joined IBM Research, and he's been working on lots of interesting work related to robotic systems and surgical simulation systems and computer-assisted surgical system and technologies at IBM. And in fact, he was a manager of the computer-assisted surgical system at IBM. I believe in 1995, he got recruited by Johns Hopkins to join its computer science department. And since then, he has really built up the robotics group there, and he is currently the director of the engineering research centers funded by NSF on computer integrated surgical systems and technologies. And in this talk, he's going to tell us a bit more about what the center has been doing and what he has been doing personally on computer integrated interventional medicine. Russ?
Okay, I should emphasize that only a small fraction of what I'm talking about is mine personally.
Turn the microphone on.
Oh, yes, thank you. I turned it off so I could tell lies without being sued, but hi. I'd like to start with which was maybe the insight that brought me into this area of computer-integrated surgery. And it's basically, when I was at IBM, I was first working on systems like this. It has sub-micron precision and sort of real-time sensing, and we used it in manufacturing test applications in IBM. And then I also worked with some people, and we built this system, which is a robot for hip replacement surgery. Now, those look really very, very different, but underneath, they do something in common. What they do is they're means of coupling information to action in the physical world to fundamentally, in partnership with people actually, to enhance a process. And what got me interested in computer-integrated surgery was the perception that that same partnership that let us do systems like this could make a big difference in interventional medicine. And what's going to drive that? Really, no one's going to buy a system like this because it's cool. But fundamentally, what we're going to do is this human-machine partnership can provide capabilities, superhuman capabilities, to human physicians. You can do things you just couldn't do. Second, these systems inherently data-driven systems are much more consistent, and you can improve quality. And so fundamentally, if you put those together, despite the cost of the system, the ultimate bottom line has got to be either better outcomes for patients or more cost-effective processes in treating patients. And those two things actually tend to go hand in hand together. So this is actually the picture I put together first at IBM to explain to my bosses why a computer company would be interested in medical robots. And the idea is you start with information about the patient. A lot of that's in the form of medical images. Information about people in general, things we call anatomical atlases today. You mush all of this together and make a computer representation of the individual patient. Using that, you can do optimized planning. But what really enables the value is you can take all of this information into the operating room or interventional suite. And if you can do that, you do some more sensing. You fuse the virtual reality of the model to the reality of the patient. And then there is a variety of appropriate technologies, some of which you might call a robot, to help you do what you plan to do. verify that you did what you planned to do, and in follow-up afterwards, you can use many of the same technologies. So we have a word for this. We call it surgical CAD/CAM. I used to be in a manufacturing research department, so this seemed very appropriate. And also, as I'll say a little bit about this loop here, this total quality management loop, which in the end, I maintain may be where the biggest impact of these computer-integrated interventions is going to come from. Just a couple quick examples. I mentioned Robotic, where we planned the intervention from CT. We used the robot basically to prepare the canal for hip replacement surgery. And I'll say maybe a word or two a little later. In our own center, a lot of the emphasis in our research has been in a variety, we call it needles everywhere. But the delivery of precise therapies at the end of some kind of a long needle or thin tube accurately placed on a target under image guidance. And again, I will be saying a fair more about this later, so right now it's just to give you a feel. Well, in addition to this notion of pre-planning, a lot of interventions are actually highly interactive. You're making many of the decisions right on the spot in the intervention room or OR. And so another way we have of talking about these systems is we call them surgical assistants. Now, underneath, they're really all the same components. It's just two different ways of looking at the same underlying technology. And just as example things that may be a little easier to think about as an assistant, here we have the Da Vinci. It is the only really commercially successful surgical robot. And here we're using various forms of information to augment the surgeon's ability to do interventions. And again, I'll say more later on these examples. Now, the key thing is we're talking about systems. We're bringing together a lot of different components. Things that go on inside the computer are just ubiquitous throughout this picture. And we have a buzzword. I call that modeling and analysis. And these are buzzwords that people working in medical imaging are very familiar with. The gadgets and gizmos, the transducers that transduce between the data world and the world of the patient and the world of the surgeon, again, are crucial to these systems. And finally, there really is a science to systems. We're dealing with very complicated systems, and in order to often to do anything, you practically have to do some of everything. So you really have to pay attention to the modularity and the rules that enable you to put these systems together in predictable and reliable ways. So that was the underlying premise that led us to propose, and we were very fortunate to be awarded an engineering research center where the core funding came from NSF in these areas of computer-integrated surgery. And we generally work in these areas, and I'll use examples from what we do to talk. We're actually in our last year of NSF funding, and at the end, if I have time, I'll say a little about what happens next. To show where we've come, this picture is from our first site visit. These centers, you're supposed to make contributions from kind of basic science up through applications, and those were the pictures from our first site visit. I ran out of room, but these are some of the pictures from our last site visit. And you might say this is what adding $30 million does, but in point of fact, I think we're able to make this kind of progress broadly, largely by taking a systems view. Here's another picture, very similar to one I had before, where, again, what we're doing is we're putting together all the information we have about the patient. We're modeling, we're planning, we're doing, and evaluating. And that is a closed-loop medicine for the patient-specific loop. And then if we think about in fact, this loop occurs at multiple time scales. And so you can think of this as surgical CAD-CAM, and this is surgical assistance. The other thing, again, when in IBM manufacturing, one of the things that was most interesting to me is we kept the data records. And over time, as we begin to do this, we generate a lot more data, and we should be able to use that, combine it with outcomes information to do what amounts to statistical process control. And so this is, I think, a major part of the future that we've just now begun to enable. Many examples. What I'm going to do for the next half hour in the talk is I'm going to use that picture really to illustrate, and then pieces of that picture, just to illustrate some of the themes as to how this all fits together. And if we look at modeling, this is an example from our partners up at the Brigham. I pick one theme to emphasize, and I feel to some extent like I'm preaching to the choir here, but you find very broadly in medical image analysis over the last 5 years, statistical models of populations of patients are becoming more and more central to the research that goes on. And we've been doing a lot of this research. I mean, an obvious thing, and again, this is from my student Zhenhua Yao maybe 8 years ago. What you're seeing is he's adapting the statistical model to the CT, and then at the end he's gotten close, and then he does a final deformable registration to match the model. Now, one other thing you can do with these models is you can fill in information. So again, this is from Yao's thesis. Here we have a statistical model giving us 3D shape variation and also 3D variation of the density of the patient's bones. And then from a small number of x-rays, basically you can use the statistics to generate the most likely model that would produce the x-ray images that you're seeing. And this was actually, Yao did this on simulation. More recently, we've been using real images, as I'll show you. Here, again, this is showing how the process works. Here's the model. The green, which you saw there, was a projection image, and here's a similarity score. So basically, you're hill climbing. In this case, this is basically a mutual information similarity score. Here is an example actually being done on real fluoroscopy images of where we just have three images, and we're recovering a 3D shape model of, in this case, it's a pelvis. Here's another example. This is some current work that we have with an industrial partner, Hologic, but it's research at this point. What you would like to do is a 3D finite element analysis of a patient's bones to predict the risk of fracture from osteoporosis. Now, what you have available to you is a couple dual energy X-ray projections. And so what we've done is basically that same process that I showed you before to predict, or to given the X-ray projections, to guess what the 3D structure would be. This one's a year and a half old. It's a little bit better than this now. But then what we're doing is we're comparing biomechanical properties that we're computing from the CT model to biomechanical properties that we're getting from this best guess CT model. And we're getting very, very, very encouraging correlations, although there's still some more work to be done. before we can definitively say that this is good. But it's typical of the sort of thing that is being done with these statistical models. Another thing that you'd like to do in an operating room sometimes is you'd like to make a CT-like reconstruction on the spot. But you don't usually have a CT scanner in an OR. So you can do what are called cone beam reconstructions from a fluoroscopic X-ray machine. Now, there are practical difficulties in using this in a real OR. You can't always swing the X-ray machine through the full sweep of angles that you need to do this kind of reconstruction. And also, the field of view of a portable C-arm is fairly limited. So the idea that we've been evaluating has been to basically to fuse the, do a deformable registration of the of our model to the X-ray images that we have, then use the fused representation or the model to fill in any missing projections, and then go back and do tomographic reconstruction. And as you can tell, we're able to remove quite a lot of the artifact. Again, this is a fairly old image from Krishna's thesis. We're just now have got all of this working on a real fluoro system, and I just didn't have time to get the image in there. But again, here is the process that we're doing. I'm sorry if I seem to be going really fast, but I always talk myself out of time, and I'm trying to leave some time for questions. So that's just a small example of the kind of thing that we're interested in building up representations, where the goal generally is the computer should put into a uniform data representation everything you know about the patient, so you can use it for things like planning interventions. Now, again, taking a systems point of view, our friends at the Brigham have developed an interactive visualization system they call Slicer. And this is, of course, as part of the ERC, been integrated into our systems infrastructure, and we use it for a lot of interventional planning and online intervention control, although as I'll say later, our architecture is modular, so occasionally we use other software as well. Here is an example. Here what we're doing is these are actually, it's an odd projection of safety barriers in the skull that when you're trying to drill out the skull base to get at an acoustic neuroma, you don't want to drill too far, and we've just defined some safety barriers, and I'll show you later how we take advantage of that. And again, there are many, many, many other examples of planning. I just only had time just to give some flavor, because I think what people, I was told, really want to see is robots. So this is kind of where that comes in the action. Again, I want to emphasize that what we're really dealing with is integrated systems that include a lot of information. So here is Robodoc. In this case, rather than hips, this was an example using knees. And so here was the plan generated from CT. I'm leaving off the registration step. And occasionally I've had people get weak stomachs. But here is the robot actually machining, I think that's the femoral component there. I have a hard time telling just by looking. It's going back and forth. This is basically like a giant Dremel tool. I should emphasize that surgical navigation systems are also ways of coupling information to action. You don't always need a robot, and it's important to remember that. if you can do it with human dexterity and an information support, that is often enough. It also is giving me an excuse to admit I once had darker hair. This is one of actually the first navigation systems to do something other than neurosurgery. This was a system Court Cutting and I put together for computer-assisted craniofacial osteotomies. And one of the neat things about this was Court had a system in which he had actually an anatomical statistical atlas of normal facial anatomy that was used for planning the interventions. So we did this, I think about 92 back at IBM. I should also mention that the most common example are robot-assisted needle placement. This is just a very conventional. This was the first real use of robots in surgery, was to basically replace a stereotactic head frame. And here is a current commercial system for doing that. Here's an example. This is a system that we developed with an industrial partner, Cliff Burdett, combining a commercial prostate brachytherapy planning and guidance system, which is based on intraoperative transrectal ultrasound, and replacing the little grid that they normally use for telling you where the needles should go with a very, very simple robot. And the advantage of this, aside from being faster and less error prone, is you can actually control the angle of the needle. And that can often be important. For instance, the pubic bone can be in the way, and with the conventional method, you can't get a needle to the robot. So again, this is an extremely simple robot, but the important thing is you've integrated it back with a planning system, sort of from one-stop shopping. Here is another system with X-ray guidance. This is a system that Dan Stoyanovich, Louis Whitcomb, and I developed, although Dan was the principal developer. Here we have a radiolucent needle guide, and we're placing a needle into the filling system of a kidney as the first step of percutaneous kidney stone removal. Now, one of the things that if you're going to use a robot to drive a needle into the patient's body, it's important to realize that there's a very natural pivot point where you go into the body. And you can obviously control any robot to maintain that constraint, but if you can have a very simple structure, and this is actually more complicated than some, that mechanically decouples all the motions at that point, it greatly simplifies some of your safety systems and some other parts of your system design. So we've built a number of these isocentric or remote center of motion robots. Here's an example where what we've done is the needle driver has a fiducial structure. This is equipped sort of similar to a BRW head frame. And what you do here is that from in CT fluoro, from even one slice through that, we know exactly where the needle driver is. Now here we're biopsying this candid tumor with the needle in plane. But you can also, if you can't see the needle in the image, you can still know where it is by analyzing that structure. And so you're using, one of the very important things is if you have an image for targeting and you can use the image to help you close your feedback loop, you're going to be a lot more accurate and a lot simpler setup too. Moving up the technology scale, I suppose, although the robot is mechanically much simpler, this is a system for in-MRI transrectal prostate biopsy that's been in use down at NIH. It was developed by these folks here. Axel Krieger and Rob Susel are the two main people behind the robot. Here's another robot that Dan Stoyanovich did for, again, in-MRI needle placement. Materials are a huge problem, and the thing that's neat about this robot is it's made completely of plastic, and it has a really fiendishly clever air stepper motor that is used to actuate it. Now, one of the challenges, this is the work here primarily of Allison Nakamura, Bob Webster, and now a cast of not thousands, but dozens, where if you have, the idea is you'd like to hit a target, and if you look at a needle, they often have a little bevel. And if you push, that's going to generate a deflecting force. That could either be a problem because you aim and you don't hit what you're aiming at, but you can actually, by rotating the needle, you can actually steer the needle like a bicycle. And so this work is now part of an R01 that Allison is the principal investigator on, and there have been a number of other things. This is some related work from Cam Revere at CMU. I should just mention again, this is primarily the work of Bob Webster. If you take nitinol tubes that have a bend in them, and then you twist them so they counter-rotate, you can do all sorts of amazing things with the shape of these needles, and they can be actually still quite stiff and strong. There are a number of problems in terms of modeling and planning and guiding these things, because there are catastrophes or sudden discontinuities in this shape. But it is, I think, a very promising approach. Again, this is, you don't always need a computer at all. This is similar to the setup that Henry has, except here all we're doing is we're setting things up so that you have the virtual image of a scan plane through a patient lined up with the corresponding physical location. Then you can use hand-eye coordination just to do the placement. This was actually the first experiments we did with Ken Masamune, Gabor, and me. The vegetable, that's a melon. The Vegetable Care and Use Committee had no objection, and it was a fast approval. This is the current system. This is an MRI-compatible version, and it's just going into clinical testing for perispinal nerve block procedures. Another thing, we always get very excited about human use of medical robots. It could very well be that the biggest impact of medical robots is going to be from treating rats. And the reason is if you're trying to develop new cancer therapies, as an example, you have to do an awful lot of work on small animals, and it is really crucial that your experimental technique be highly consistent and highly targeted. And so this is one of several systems. This is one that we built in partnership with Memorial Sloan Kettering, and it's a small animal needle placement system. There have been a couple others that I've seen, including a couple I've reviewed from various groups. And so this is, I think, an important area. This is a current machine. This is a radiation therapy machine for small animals, where what we've done is we've combined cone beam tomography with basically you move the beam around, get the detector plate out of the way, you turn up the power of the beam, and we can put a very highly collimated beam, a sub-millimetric diameter beams for doing radiation therapy in small animals. And it's one-stop shopping. The thing is very small and can be shielded, and you can just put it right in your animal facility. And again, I think the big impact is as an enabler for both cancer therapy and for just basic biology research. So those are some of these examples. You can think of this as the surgical CAD-CAM. I mentioned we're also have systems where the decisions are being made much more interactively in the OR, and it's a little easier to think of these as assistants. But again, there's a lot of things. Here, one of the lines of research we've had ongoing for some time has been to make surgical instruments smarter. And these are cases where we've got force sensing, and basically you can think of these as pulse oximeters built down into the business end of these surgical retractors. And what we're trying to tell is, are we retracting so hard that we're interrupting the blood supply? Here's another similar experiment where this is done with a fiber optic spectrometer. This was an undergraduate project that was done last summer. And what we were interested in is when you do a laparoscopic partial nephrectomy, they cut the blood supply off to the kidney and they start a clock. If the clock goes gong, you now are doing a total nephrectomy because you assume the kidney is not going to make it. What you maybe would like to know is some direct measurement of the oxygenation state or the ischemia of the kidney. And so what this undergrad did is she took this sensor, and there was a study going on of partial nephrectomies. And so what happens is the kidney, when you first cut off the blood supply, it gets pinker, it blushes. And then here it's getting bluer, and here's where we unclamp. This was just a very preliminary result. Before we do anything with it, we have a lot more to do, but I think it's suggestive of the kind of thing you can do. If we look at telesurgical assistance, the actual use of robots to assist in surgery, most people are, I assume, familiar with the Da Vinci. The surgeon sits here, looks at a stereo TV image taken from a laparoscopic camera, and moves two control handles that have little wrists on them, and the surgical instruments do the same thing. So it feels to the surgeon like he's inside the patient's body. What we've been interested in doing is developing a number of enhancements to the, largely information enhancements, to the surgeon to make that environment more effective. And in doing that, what we've been doing is we've been developing with Intuitive an open source research environment that has a modular interface to all of the surgical robots. If you have from Intuitive, if they're willing to license their API to you, what all of this research stuff, which is again a highly modular system, will work very, very well with the Intuitive robot. But we're also using the same thing for our robots or other people's research surgical robots as well. Just to give an example of the information, what this is primarily the work of Greg Hager and Balish, I can never pronounce his last name, where what they did is, this again is a laparoscopic partial nephrectomy. Here you have the kidney tumor. Here's the surface of the kidney. From stereo video, they registered stereo video to a prior CT model of the kidney and are tracking it in real time. Now, and then are able to generate, if you saw this in stereo, that would appear, that's the cut here line, and it would appear to be on the surface of the kidney. Now, we have not actually used this as feedback to the surgeon in real time. The visualization is being done in real time but offline because you need some IRB approvals, but we're beginning to look at follow-on steps here. One of the other projects we have with Intuitive is to equip the Da Vinci surgical robot with a laparoscopic ultrasound probe. This is from phase 1 of the study with a rigid laparoscopic probe. And again, this is just simply showing the ultrasound flashlight mode, that quite similar to what you've been doing for Lo these many years. And although we now have a wristed probe, and we're looking at a lot of alternate ways of presenting the ultrasound information. Now here, what we have is looking on to robots. One of the problems with good things about the Da Vinci is it's marvelous. As you make the instrument smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually you get a point where all those little bearings and pulleys and pivots, you can't would not be economically manufacturable. So here what we've done is we built a snake-like robot with only bending metal. What we have down the outside of the robot is there are 3 spines. Now, if you have 2 spines, if I push on my top and pull on the bottom, I'll get bending. And if I do it the other way, I can't bend my fingers back. With 3, you get bending in 2 directions. So what we have here are 3 tubes, and that gives us 2 degrees of freedom. And running through each tube is a little rod, a little wire. So we have 4 degrees of freedom right down in the rest. This one is 4.2 millimeters, but we believe the design is readily scalable, certainly maybe to 2.5 or 3 before you really begin to worry about scalability. And then there's just, in this case, a very simple gripper. Whoa, what happened? I was expecting at that point to, why is that there? It's out of place. One of my slides got moved, and and this is just showing the robot suturing. Here's maybe, this is the most recent video, and here our initial application is going to be taking 2 of these in parallel through, still in phantom, but down to suture down below the vocal cords. The advantage of this kind of robot is you can get both tools with very high dexterity into a confined space through a single access port. So this is sort of the state of that. Ooh, I better hurry. I should just mention there are various other ways to get dexterity at a patient's body. From our CMU affiliate, this is some of the work of Cam Revere, where he has a little robot that actually crawls across the exterior surface of the heart. Here's another example. In this case, again, this is from CMU, where we're dealing with microsurgery, where you have tremor in the hand. And what he does is he has an inertial, let me just, sensor. Okay, this is just hand tremor, but if he senses the tremor, he can actually compensate for it. Now, we've been pursuing at Hopkins another version here where both the surgeon and the robot hold the same surgical tool. And then you have a little force sensor, so the robot feels you pulling on the sensor and it just follows your hand. We call this steady hand manipulation. And again, it's tremor-free. In this case, if you let go of the tool, it'll sit there. This is a little more precise than that, but it's a little more cumbersome to get into the OR. One of the applications we've been exploring with this has been cannulation of retinal vessels. I believe it's the second most common cause of vision loss from a problem in the retina is a blood clot in your eye. And the blood clot is in a blood vessel about the size of the hair on your head. So the hypothesis is if you could reliably and quickly and with a routine surgeon insert a needle into the blood vessel, you can inject something that would dissolve the clot. There's been a lot of interest in this, but especially in these smaller vessels, it's just not practical without some kind of an aid. So we've been using this application and another one of peeling epiretinal membranes to drive our research. You can actually take the same idea, even a scale smaller. This is some work of my student Ankur Kapoor, Rajesh Kumar, who was actually my first PhD graduate, who then went off to industry and is now back working with us as a research faculty member. But here what we're doing is, again, it's that same hand-over-hand guiding for injecting material in the mouse lab into mouse embryos. This is an application where the technicians takes them a year to get good with conventional instruments, and then they quit. And here, it's so intuitive that grad students were getting 100% survival right away. But what I really want to emphasize is this. These, again, are barriers. Here we've used computer vision to implement very, very simple virtual fixtures or chamfers that help guide you to the right target, but still give the human some flexibility within those limits to pick the exact target. Now, one of the things I'd like to emphasize is I've shown a bunch of gadgets, but ultimately it is the gadgets give you some capability, but it is the information that lets you use the capability. And what we've really done is, for instance, in this telerobotic case, we've really put a computer with a lot of information between the surgeon's hands and the surgical instrument. And whether you're doing teleoperation or hand-over-hand operation or this active tremor cancellation, doesn't really, it does matter, but not a great deal. There is still a very large part of these systems, and the underlying problem is really basically the same. And this is one of the motivations we had for building this modular open source environment where certainly I'm expecting by September we're really wanting to get lots of collaborators to work with us on it. If I just talk about a few other, again, I can't help show that this is some very old IBM work. So this whole thing goes way, way back. And I think what's really changed in the last 15 years is not maybe the ideas, but our ability to actually execute the ideas. Here is some work, again, from Alison Nakamura, where what we're doing is she's sensing how hard we're pulling on that suture and just overlaying a little visual indicator for the surgeon as to, hey, you're about to break that suture. Here's another example. In this case, we're using virtual fixtures, which, again, we have a way of solving all of the rather complex constrained behavior as nonlinear optimization problems. And just to show a couple examples. So the idea is that you can break down a rather complicated surgical gesture into very small components that each has its own little set of constraints and objective functions, and you can put all of these together and then very, very efficiently solve a nonlinear optimization problem to let you control the robot. And as one example, here, what we're trying to do is move a bent instrument down inside the patient's body without impinging on any constraints. Here we're just using this bone phantom, say you can't touch the bone phantom. In a more real case, that you could think of these as brain structures you've identified. And again, we're able to automatically generate the constraints largely using some computer graphics techniques, but basically generate the constraints and go through this whole loop about 200 times a second, which is more than sufficient for this sort of surgical robot control. And so here, this slide is showing you the motion and just what it looks like. The main point is, again, it doesn't matter whether you're using hand-over-hand control or some sort of joystick. Underneath, it's the same system. And all this shows is, yes, indeed, you can be much more accurate than freehand. I better hurry. Here's a little bit more sophisticated virtual fixture where we're trying to follow the path of a curved needle where we've deliberately grasped it in a very awkward way and trying to insert it without tearing the tissue. I'm going to skip. This is neat. Here is a visually guided, whoa, there it goes, two-handed virtual fixtures, the first two-handed virtual fixture anyone has done. And the point is that to center a knot, what you have to do is you have to make it the motion of the left and right hand. If you pull on one, the other has to follow you just right, or if it's doing autonomously or whatever, and it helps you keep the knot directly on center. One other example, here is again that acoustic neuroma example. We've put together a system where here is the, where again it's this hand-over-hand control, and this is a neurosurgery resident, and he's milling out that cavity. I want to make a point here, and then I'm going to have to really speed up. Here's our surgical robot, or I'm sorry, this is our surgeon. He's working really hard. Here is the surgical robot, and in a moment you're going to see the robot actually gives the surgeon superhuman capabilities. So the robot is going to help the surgeon. So this is the surgeon's worst nightmare about a surgical robot. And it's humorous, but it does make a good point. If you're going to assist a surgeon, you both need to know what the limits of what you're doing are, and it's also really important to be able to interpret what the surgeon is doing, so the assistance you provide is appropriate. And here's some work. There's several groups around the country. This is primarily the work of Greg Hager, where what he's trying to do is develop what he calls the language of surgery by either using the Da Vinci robot or more recently just visually tracking surgical instruments to automatically segment the motions. This is a fourth-throw suture by an expert heart surgeon. And there are a lot of uses for this, including you can use it as an assessment vehicle in things like training simulators. So let me just mention a couple examples of patient-specific evaluation, and then I'll try to just talk about a couple other system things and be done very quickly. Here, what you can't really, you'd like to be able to use X-rays to assess where you've actually left those seeds in the prostate, but then you need to fuse that back to the ultrasound. And we have a number of projects. This is from Amit Jain's recent PhD thesis for doing that. Here's another example, primarily the work of Emad Bakhtar. We're doing RF ablation of liver tumors, and you basically are cooking the tumor. You can use ultrasound to guide, but it's hard to assess just from ultrasound what you're doing. So you could just say, I'll cook for 10 minutes. Now, what he's doing is he's tracking the speckle. As you push on the tissue, the speckle moves with the tissue. And from this, you can compute the relative strain of the relative elasticity of the tissue. And so here is the meat, the cooked meat that has been found. It's really like testing meat on a grill. And there are a number of other examples of using elastography both for feedback and for image segmentation purposes and the like. I want to say just a word or two about this process loop where not much has been done, largely because the NSF told us to keep our focus here, and also because you need these really working to give you the information to begin to look at statistical process control. And one area that we're just starting to work in is radiation therapy planning. Our radiation oncology department are building a clinical database of all of their patients. It has the images, the treatment plans, the outcomes, the genetics. And one of the things that we're starting to look at especially is looking at the geometry of the patient, the shapes of the organs and their relations. And the basic goal is you'd like to be able to say, of all the patients in this database, Here are the 25 who look most like this patient. In rank order, here are the complications. And by the way, here's the best treatment plan that we found so far. And we're going to use that as our initialization for a custom treatment plan for that patient. And I'm about to talk myself out of time, so I really can't go further. But this is something that I'm extremely excited by. And we're working with both radiation oncology and another CS faculty member, Misha Kasdan, on it. If you look intraoperatively, where we're headed with all of these things is the operating rooms really themselves are going to be integrated systems closely tied to all of this information infrastructure and things like that language of surgery. All of one possible use is just simply to diagnose what went wrong. You really can become a flight data recorder of the operating room. Here's one other just simple informatics example I think that's really neat. About one time in 1,000, one time in 1,500, someone will leave something in the patient, like a sponge or a needle, or once in a great while, something spectacular like forceps. But most commonly, it's sponges. And so a number of groups have been, including ours, have been developing various ways of doing this process in which we use RF basically tagging on the sponges to keep track of where they are in the operating room at any given moment. And the neat thing here is this is just a kick bucket that, well, now we have a plastic one that, and we can count, we can basically know where every sponge is and then integrate that back into the hospital logistics. So where I'm going with the ERC, and then I probably won't make too much in it, is we're really moving to continue to do work here, but also more and more to begin to integrate with some of these broader informatics themes. We know what we did. We can be more consistent with what we did. We know what we wanted to do. And eventually we know what happened with the patient. And so I really think that's a major theme as this field moves forward. I should just say that we have a really nice new laboratory. Here is our lab space. We have individual faculty lab pods all around the edge. I don't remember if I have, and upstairs we have a mock operating room. Here is that neurosurgery setup for doing systems integration work. And the really cool thing about the facility is that the robotics faculty at Hopkins were all together, right next to each other, and all our students are thrown in together. And we have also swing space for our clinical collaborators, which says if you're going to work in this field, the most important thing is you need strong and committed teams of surgeons, engineers, industry people. I think focusing on actual problems is important. Ralph Gomery at IBM always used to say that two things you should always ask yourself is how will you know when you will succeed and who will care and why? And I think these kind of partnerships where you rapidly try things out in partnership with your end users keeps your engineering research honest and focused and often helps you actually be more innovative. The final thing I tell my students, this is hard. You have to learn a lot more than just a straight robotics or graphics thesis you wouldn't have to learn. So you better really plan to spend a lot of time on it, but have fun doing it. And also find it very rewarding. What really changed my career in IBM was the perspective that I could use the same kind of technology that we were using basically to make computers better, to help make people better. And in the final analysis, yeah, this is a great field. People can get tenure. You can make maybe money commercializing something. But in the end, we're all going to be where this person is. It could be our mother. It could be our sister. It could be anyone. And the most rewarding thing is when you've done something and you see it in use directly helping people. And I think that's the real motivation for our students. And I apologize for talking that long. I was actually talking 50 minutes rather than 40, but I'm done. I have plenty of time for, I will take as much time as people want for questions. Yes.
Hold on a second.
Are there people out there? Or?
Yeah, we are going to ask question first from the remote side.
Oh dear, we don't have very many remote speakers, so.
Question from Duke or NC State?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, Russell. Carlo Tomasi from Duke.
Okay.
I'm interested in knowing if there are, what are the main fundamentally unmet needs in computer vision or signal sensing.
Oh, boy, the fundamental needs, there. Okay, I can rattle off off a list. Processing of information about medical imaging is clearly extracting information from these medical image sources and fusing them into a common representation is pretty crucial. And it really is surprising the extent to which even now computer vision techniques really aren't always so familiar to the medical imaging community. And so I think one of the things where people like Greg Hager have had a real impact is because he knows so much about real-time computer vision, is able to take some of that and begin to apply it to these very challenging medical problems, which in turn force you to invent. I think another area, I kind of alluded to it, is in fact being able to do the vision processing and the information fusion in real time. The environments inside the body, they're sort of red, but they're complicated. You have glares. It's very challenging to deal with these sort of real-time deforming environments. Keep track of where you are. I mean, I didn't talk about some of our other work where we're trying to build up these real-time models as you move an endoscope in a patient, and then to track. Finally, there is the interpretation issue of how, by watching, can you do task segmentation. So those are at least three of the really hard problems that we have. Other questions from out there in TV land?
In general, I'd like to think that you will succeed this in some target-specific areas. You'll have maybe a robot for handling prostate surgery, robot for handling knees, and I'd like to get a feeling: are there any robots in the field or in the planning, and in what area?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question. I think what you're advancing the hypothesis that you might have robots that are designed for specific parts of the body or specific applications, rather than the completely general robot. And that is true. Now, in terms of which specifics, I think what area where we're beginning to see that is robots for needle driving in different imaging environments. Like a robot that you've designed to work in a CT scanner is going to be very different than a robot that you've designed to work in a MRI scanner versus something that is kind of used in open surgery with a say an ultrasound feedback. It's always I think the other area that people, if you look at the gadgets and gizmos, are very, very interested in is providing a lot more dexterity in small confined spaces inside the patient's body. there's a lot of interest in something called NOTES, which is natural orifice something or other surgery, but the idea is basically you bring all the instruments in through some orifice like the mouth or some other orifice, and you say poke through the stomach and you can take out the patient's appendix through his mouth. And people do that. The challenge from a robotic point of view is keeping track of where you are inside the body and then providing very high dexterity in a very small package. And there's a lot of mechanical engineering work targeted toward that. I've had some discussions with my colleague Nabil Saman, who is now at Columbia, he was the designer, the principal designer of that snake robot of ours, as to how we can adapt that to a more flexible endoscopy environment. But those would be some examples.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I can't hear.
Can you repeat the question, please? And speak louder.
I don't hear a question out there. Maybe I discouraged them, or maybe it was a snide remark.
Ross is already from NCST.
Okay.
Could you allude a little bit more on the scalability issue in relation to the NC works well with big people, but where do you think we could go for pediatrics?
I heard, could I elaborate a little bit more on the scalability issue, and after that I kind of lost it. There's a lot of static. But I think the scalability issues from a mechanical design point of view are very real. The problem is you would like to preserve very high dexterity, but as you make things smaller, they get less strong. And one of the advantages of the particular design that we had for the snake-like robot is those flexible spines around the outside. Both are providing the transmission of actuation force and structural strength. It's like a little girder that bends. Now, one thing that you're fortunate at is that often as you make things smaller, you're dealing with very delicate small structures that you don't need to exert a lot of force. The other thing I think that's very important, and I didn't really allude to here, is as you make things smaller, you'd still like to provide real-time sensing out at the business end, and that can either be very small endoscopic, video endoscopy, with some of which is getting, 1 millimeter diameter cameras they've got, and some of it are other sorts of sensing where we've been exploring basically fiber optics, which has the extra advantage that you don't have MRI compatibility problems. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
So I was wondering, when you were showing the kidney, I believe it was, you had the tumor virtually superimposed over the kidney, and there was a lot of wandering in that, and it looked like the view from position wasn't changing that much, and so it wasn't even a latency effect. It looked like like the registration might be off or something. My question is, if users find that disturbing, because we found that people, when they're wearing, for instance, a head-mounted display, they get very, very easily nauseous.
Oh, you're talking about simulator sickness, basically.
If there's any simulator sickness. Because, I mean, it's wandering a centimeter or more.
Well, the kidney is moving. I mean, he's operating on the kidney, and there is a little bit of tracking delay. This was a first result done with fairly naive implementations. I should mention there is some similar work that's not using vision tracking at CASE, but no, well, first here, where you would be using this is you're looking at a display that would either be like either a mono or stereo display up on the wall, or in the case if you were using this with a DaVinci, you'd be looking through the DaVinci eyepieces, and what it would look to you like this thing is moving. It wouldn't look to you, but it would look to you like you're stable, because also, you know, you're tugging and pulling on the kidney, and that's the motion you're seeing, really.
So all of the motion that we're seeing, I mean, because there's relative motion of the red circle with respect to the
That's
kidney.
tracking delay, and from the real-time vision, and yeah, you'd like to make that better, but this is a very preliminary result. I mean, that Greg and Balish, I was a collaborator on it for some of the 3D registration pieces, but it's a very preliminary result, and yeah, I mean, obviously you'd like it to anticipate the motion and do all of these things, but I mean, the reaction of the surgeon is, wow, when can I get it into my OR? And we're saying, you know, caution, caution, we've got more work to do.
Okay.
Other, yes.
I was thinking about that little joke piece where you had the robot coming and
yeah.
pushing the car off the cliff. When people do things, they work with a kind of approximation that's sort of different from what is used in statistics or mathematics. You have a general concept of where you want to go. Maybe the man, I didn't know what man wanted to do, but maybe he wanted to move 8 inches to off the road. And the robot said, sure.
Yeah.
And is there something like that that is implemented or can be implemented to have gross limitations on what one is trying to do, a very sketchy idea of what one's trying to do, and then tell the robot more closely what you want and introduce statistics?
Yeah, I think the devil is in the details there. I think that's a really good question. I put that up not to say it's solved, but to really, I made that slide for a workshop where we were talking about emerging research problems, and that's a really big one.
Oh, okay.
But I think one of the things that you could do is, if you can define from the clinical application what the limitations on the robot, like safety barriers. An example that you could actually incorporate some of this back into the optimization framework we have. That you could, I'm speculating on the fly, and this is always dangerous, but suppose that what I've done is I've defined, it's that neuromas case. Suppose I've defined the safety barriers. Says whatever you do, don't let that little burr get outside of that limit. But what I could still do is I could say, gee, by watching how hard the guy is pushing and how fast, I think that what he wants me to do is go a little faster, and I could feed that into the objective function. And because the way it works is you say, do take whatever capabilities the robot has, and subject to whatever limitations you have in the robot and the surgical safety constraints and all of that, do as near as you can what the surgeon wants you to do without violating these constraints. So within that context, you could perhaps do something like that. I think that's real research. I mean, how do you model intentions? How do you model your limitation on your model of intentions?
Oh,
But
I
I,
have a
yeah.
sub-question, which is perhaps, thank you for that.
No, okay.
I was wondering how much the tremor compensation is similar to what one has in optical instruments these days. You have the digital cameras, the video cameras that you can move them around and they still
Sure.
show you the object you're looking at.
No, it's the same idea, or noise-canceling headphones. I mean,
Yes.
it's that idea. In fact, I should mention that Dr. Hager and Dr. Revere have an NIH grant in which one of the things they're doing is the idea is to use real-time vision as a feedback to help stabilize that handheld instrument against a feature. And we're Cam, Greg, and me, and some eye surgeons are looking, are hoping to get some NIH funding to take that whole idea to the next stage to make a really smart assistance system for retinal surgery. And so we have some pending proposals that we hope are funded. If not, we'll have to find some other way to do it. Other questions? Yeah.
This one's not very well formed, but it's, you had a little bit of mention there of the team of collaboration between the surgeons and the industry, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more. I mean, thinking of, this as computer-aided design CAD-CAM. I mean, it used to be that all the auto companies had their own in-house CAD-CAM, and so to do research on CAD-CAM, you connected with the auto companies. Now it seems like you either, you connect with Dassault or some company that's selling CAD-CAM to the audio companies, or you deal with people like AutoCAD that are selling CAD-CAM to the masses, and you write plugins for them. How do you, what's the state? I mean, there's a lot of different pieces of this in vision and instruments and clinical applications, and getting it past the regulatory agencies. Are all of these sort of, I mean, what are the places that a researcher comes in and does things and has impact in these different areas? Elaborate more.
Okay, let me try to answer that question, but let me first just briefly mention the question I thought you were going to ask.
Okay.
Which, the question I thought you were going to ask is, well, do you see things being sort of specialized? And there, I think one example, there are a few places. One example is in Strasbourg, Maresca's and Luc Soleil run a surgical planning service for liver surgery, in which through the internet they receive medical images, typically CTs, of a patient with liver cancer, and then what they do is they say, okay, here is our recommendation of what resection planes you want to have, and here is what fraction of good liver that patient will have left if you do cut here, and they send back sort of reference images. Internally, they have some efforts that are in some ways similar to this, for trying to fuse that for intraoperative guidance for liver resection. So things like that I think are happening. Now, the question then that you did ask is, well, how can individual researchers who don't want to do everything but want to do one thing have an impact? And that one of the goals of that open source environment was to, because we tend to have ourselves a lot of the tools and want to, say, work with you guys on something, we need some way of putting them together. And honestly, I think the key is, in fact, to define these open environments, but still very rigorously defined modular interfaces. Now, then you mentioned regulation. There are two issues here. One is, how do you convince a hospital IRB to let you use any piece of researchy stuff on a patient? And that's always, you have to be very conservative, you have to be very careful. I mean, Henry's had probably earlier success than anyone in doing that. Well, you did get to do that breast biopsy thing pretty early. And you have to take very small incremental steps. I think the broader issue, the other thing that you can do is you can define some testing of the entire integrated system. And to some extent, people already do that, like, you can You don't always have to certify that your guidance system always works with everybody's different CT scanners. But still, you'd like some way that you can define the interfaces and the assumptions that are open enough to be flexible, but still well enough defined so that you can put bounds on them. And of course, these are classic computer science problems. And I think they're actually very interesting computer science problems. So I think there's research to be done there. As a practical matter, you have a lot easier time convincing an IRB to let you try something, or convincing yourself if you have a system where you have very modular interfaces and you can say, okay, here is the information that the rest of the system is giving me, and here is what I'm doing. But there's not a magic answer. Other than the kind of motherhoody answer. Standardization is, of course, part of it. But I think there's another part, which is we've actually got to do research to figure out how to characterize whole families of interventions and whole families of behaviors that you might be going to ask of a system, and then reason about them in common. Now, of course, one place that we've thought about that are the configuration space motion planners that we've looked at for these many years for other applications. I don't know, do like other guys in the audience who've worked with clinicians have any more wise answers? I don't. None? Okay. The more you see, the more you do tend to respect both IRBs and some of the things the FDA wants. So I think it's certainly just simply to say that they're all the enemy doesn't help. Other questions or?